"Follow me, please," she whispered it barely above a breath. A 27-year-old delivery woman standing in the doorway of Il Faro, the most feared restaurant in Chicago, on the night of the worst blizzard the city had seen in decades. Her uniform was soaked through and frozen stiff, her lips had gone gray, and she clutched an insulated delivery bag against her chest, like it was the only thing keeping her alive. She'd walked 5 miles through that storm to knock on the one door every sane person in this city knew better than to knock on. Because behind that door sat Jonah Barone, 36 years old, the most powerful and most dangerous man in Chicago, surrounded by 100 loyal men who didn't move unless he did. He caught her before she hit the floor. And with 100 hardened men watching in absolute silence, everything they'd planned for that night suddenly ceased to matter. Because before sunrise, this ruthless Mafia boss and all 100 of his men would be walking single file through a blinding blizzard, following a poor delivery woman holding a lantern straight toward a secret that would shock the entire city. Who was she? And what could possibly make a man like Jonah Barone follow her into the storm? If this story moves you, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Share this video with someone who believes ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. Now, let's go back to the beginning of that freezing January night, 3 hours before she ever knocked on that door. 3 hours earlier, Il Faro was glowing with light, but its doors were locked tight, and the small sign hanging outside bore only 2 words: "Closed tonight." Anyone who had lived in Chicago long enough knew that Il Faro displayed that sign on exactly one night each year. Inside, 100 men filled every row of tables. No one ordered food, no one laughed loudly. Their conversations stayed barely above a murmur, like rain falling softly against a roof. These were the men the entire city spoke of in lowered voices, men who controlled the docks, the casinos, and the shipping routes the police knew well, but had never managed to touch. Yet tonight, every one of them sat with his back straight and his mouth closed, like schoolboys taking an examination. Because at the table farthest inside, beneath the only yellow lamp turned low, Jonah Barone sat alone. He was 36 years old, dressed in a black suit without a tie, his hands laced together on the polished wooden table, and he didn't need to say a word. Jonah's power had never lived in his voice. It lived in the way a man nearly 6 feet 7 inches tall automatically slowed his steps when passing Jonah's table, in the way the bartender behind the counter kept polishing a glass that was already spotless, simply so he wouldn't have to leave his post, in the way an entire room seemed to breathe, according to the rhythm of one man's breath. 2 glasses of whiskey stood on the table before Jonah. From time to time, he lifted one, took a small sip, then set it down precisely inside the damp ring it had already left behind. The second glass was filled to the brim and placed across from him, in front of an empty chair, and no one in that room dared ask who the drink was meant for. The men who had been around the longest didn't need to ask. They knew what day it was. 20 years earlier, on this very night, an old apartment building on the south side had burned to the ground, and inside that fire had been a 15-year-old girl named Bianca Barone, Jonah's only sister, while Jonah himself had been only 16. The city's official report contained just 2 words: electrical fault. Jonah had never believed those words. He hadn't believed them at 16, standing barefoot on the sidewalk and watching smoke rise into the night, and he believed them even less after spending 20 years climbing to the summit of the city's underworld. People whispered that he had built his entire empire for the sake of becoming powerful enough to do one thing, but rumors were only rumors, because Jonah never spoke to anyone about that night. Once a year, he simply closed the restaurant, poured a glass, no one drank, and sat in silence until morning. But tonight was different. The sharpest men in the room had noticed it before dusk had fully settled. Tonight, beneath Jonah's table, there was a black leather briefcase he had carried in with his own hands, even though someone else usually carried everything for him. Tonight, he had checked his watch twice, something he'd never done during the previous 19 anniversaries, because to Jonah, time was something that waited for him, never the other way around. And tonight, before taking his seat, he had said exactly one sentence to the man closest to him. At midnight, there would be a meeting, and after that meeting, a debt 20 years old would finally be paid. He hadn't said whom he was meeting. He hadn't said how the debt would be settled, but the way he spoke the word paid sent a chill down the listener's spine, because in 20 years, Jonah Barone had never used a word without first weighing its full consequence, and so the entire room sank into a particular kind of silence, the silence of 100 men who knew their boss was about to do something that had been burning inside him for 2 decades, while not one of them knew what that something was. Outside, the snow began falling harder. Local radio stations had issued a dangerous blizzard warning at 6 o'clock that evening, and the wind was gathering strength over Lake Michigan, tearing through each street as though it meant to rip the whole city from the earth. Inside the restaurant, the yellow lamp above Jonah's table swayed once when the power flickered. He didn't look up. He only stared at the second glass, still untouched and full before the empty chair, then glanced at the watch on his wrist for the 3rd time that night. 2 hours remained until midnight. 2 hours remained until the meeting he had waited 20 years to attend. Jonah Barone had no idea that the meeting would never happen, because across the city, in the middle of a blinding white storm, a young delivery woman had just pulled her battered old car to the side of the road, and fate was beginning to make moves that even the most powerful man in Chicago couldn't have foreseen. The chair across from Jonah was finally pulled out, and in that entire room there was only one man who dared do it without asking permission. Paulie Russo, 45 years old, and Jonah's second in command for 18 years, sat beside the empty chair rather than in it, a subtle courtesy he had observed faithfully for 2 decades, then placed a leather notebook with a worn spine on the table. "There's something," Paulie said, his voice rough as wheels grinding over gravel. "Pharaoh is getting ready to break ground on the south side." Jonah didn't lift his eyes from his glass. "Carmine Pharaoh breaks ground on the south side 3 times a year," he said. "He buys land, clears it, and cuts ribbons with the smile of a man who has just won at the tables. That's what he does. This time is different," Paulie said. "My man at the county office says he has just finished buying up 3 parcels around Ashland, all old buildings, all poor tenants, and the paperwork moved strangely fast, so fast that someone at City Hall must have been sitting there with a pen already in hand, waiting to sign for him." Jonah took a sip of whiskey. "He has Pike," he said. "With the deputy mayor behind him, what paper wouldn't move quickly? The whole city can smell it. No one has managed to take a picture of it, that's all." Paulie opened the notebook and turned to a page with a folded corner. "There's one more thing," he said, more slowly now. "Among the names of the people who have been hanging around Pharaoh's properties this past month, there's one nobody recognizes. He isn't a cop, isn't a reporter, isn't a debt collector. He's an old man, almost 60. Word is he used to work as an insurance appraiser and retired years ago. But suddenly he appeared and started asking questions everywhere. He asked about inspection records for the old buildings, about safety reports, even about things that happened 20 years ago. Pharaoh's people noticed him, and for the past 2 weeks, he has disappeared. No one has seen him anywhere." Jonah lifted his glass, turned it gently, and watched the amber liquid circle the sides. "A retired old man curious about real estate," he said. "Chicago has 1,000 men like that, sitting in coffee shops all day cursing the government. Let it go. Tonight, I don't have room in my head for a name I don't know." Paulie looked at his boss for a second, the look of a man close enough to understand that this wasn't the night to argue, then closed the notebook. It was the moment Jonah Barone would remember again and again in the weeks that followed, asking himself what might have happened if he had only asked one more question that night. Just one. What was the old man's name? But he didn't ask, because at that exact moment, the side door of the restaurant opened, and Martin Gable stepped inside, brushing snow from the shoulders of his gray overcoat. Gable was 52 years old and had served as the Barone family's attorney since before Jonah took control of everything. A man whose smile always fit the occasion, and whose eyes never smiled with it. "You're still planning to go out in this weather?" Gable said, removing his gloves and holding both hands toward the fireplace. "The reports say the storm will reach its worst at midnight. The roads will be completely paralyzed. You're keeping the midnight meeting as planned, or are you moving it somewhere else?" The question was offered as lightly as concern, as naturally as warmth rising from the fire, and Jonah answered without thinking. "The plan stays the same. Nothing is being moved." Gable nodded, said a few more words about documents that needed signing during the week, wished everyone a peaceful night, then left through the same side door, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and a question no one thought worth remembering, a question that should have made every hair in the room stand on end if they had known where it would lead. Outside, the storm began delivering exactly what it had promised. The wind howled down the avenue in long, drawn-out cries, and the snow no longer fell but lashed sideways, so thick and white that the streetlights were reduced to faint, trembling halos. Then the power began failing neighborhood by neighborhood. It started on the south side, then spread gradually northward, whole rows of city windows sinking into darkness one after another, as though someone were blowing out lines of candles. Inside Il Faro, the backup generator started automatically, and the lights wavered once before becoming steady again. Jonah remained still in the middle of it all, his eyes fixed on the second glass of whiskey, still untouched before the empty chair. 1 hour and 40 minutes remained until midnight. He didn't know that the meeting he had waited 20 years for would dissolve into smoke before the night was over, and that what would replace it was dragging numb feet through the snow exactly 5 miles south of where he sat. That same evening, on the south side of the city, Selina Holt was hurrying toward the 37th delivery of her 12-hour shift. 27 years old, wearing a dark blue delivery uniform faded across both shoulders. She clutched a pizza box to her chest as she ran up 4 flights of stairs in an apartment building without an elevator, knocked on the door, smiled, wished the customer a warm evening, and received nothing but a nod from someone who couldn't be bothered to look at her face. People didn't look at delivery workers. 3 years of doing this job in Chicago had taught Selina that much, that she could cross the entire city every day, knock on hundreds of doors, and remain as invisible as the wind. When she reached her car, she sat behind the wheel, pulled off her gloves, and counted the tips she had earned that day. $1 bills, a few $5 bills, and 2 quarters someone had tossed into her palm, $43.50 altogether, then carefully tucked the money into an old envelope with the word hospital written across the front. $22,000 still remained. That was what was left of the medical debt from the 14 months her mother had spent in the oncology ward, a debt their insurance had refused to cover for the most part, and the hospital continued to send reminders about once every month. The Holt family hadn't originally been from Chicago. They had left the city when Selina was too young to remember why, lived in Ohio for almost her entire childhood, and returned only 3 years ago, when her mother needed treatment at one of the city's major hospitals. Her mother had died the previous fall. After that, there had been only Selina and her father. And now there was only Selina, because her father, Frank Holt, 58 years old, had vanished from the face of the earth exactly 12 days earlier. There had been no phone call, no message, and his old car was still parked in front of the house. Selina had gone to the police station 4 times during those 12 days. The first time, they filed a report. The second time, they told her to wait. The third time, the officer at the desk didn't even turn on his computer. He merely looked at her across the counter and said, "Grown men have the right to disappear, Miss Holt, especially widowers. They need space. Go home. When he is finished grieving, he will come back." The fourth time, she stood in the station parking lot for 10 minutes, then turned around and left without going inside. That night, after the delivery system announced that service was being suspended because of the storm, Selina reached home at 7 o'clock, sat on the edge of her bed, took out a tube of shoe glue, and began repairing the right shoe whose sole had been coming apart since the previous week. She pressed it together, held it still, and waited for the glue to dry, movement so familiar that she no longer needed to look at what her hands were doing. It was while she sat there waiting that her eyes settled on her father's tool cabinet in the corner, and she remembered that she had never gone through it since the day he disappeared. She opened the bottom drawer, lifted a stack of old maps, and found it lying underneath. A sealed yellow envelope with 3 words written across the front in her father's handwriting. For Selina, urgent. Inside the envelope were 2 things. The first was a small black USB drive no larger than her thumb. The second was a sheet of paper folded into quarters, and beneath the light of the desk lamp, Selina read every line her father had written by hand, her fingers growing colder with each word. "Daughter, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home as planned. Don't panic. I'm still alive, but I have to hide, and I can't tell you where I am because they'll watch you in order to find me. Don't open this USB drive anywhere connected to wireless internet. Don't trust your phone. Don't go to the police. Don't go to City Hall. The people who are supposed to protect you are the people you must stay farthest away from. If you're ever in real danger and there is no one left you can trust, go to Il Faro on Taylor Street. Knock on the door. Tell the man there whose daughter you are. I know how insane this must sound, but trust me this one time. That man owes a debt to the truth, and I'm holding that truth. I'm sorry for everything. I love you." Selina read the letter 3 times. She looked at the USB drive in her palm, then out the window, where the blizzard was tearing the city apart into white fragments. And finally, at the name Il Faro, a name anyone who had lived in Chicago for 3 years had heard spoken in whispers. It was the kind of door no sensible person ever knocked on. But her father was hiding from someone out there, and he had been gone for 12 days in the harshest winter the city had seen in a decade, while Chicago had already shown her clearly that there was no other door left to try. Selena slipped the envelope beneath the innermost layer of her clothing, pulled on her still damp uniform jacket, picked up her car keys, and stepped outside, straight into the heart of the storm. Selena's car gave a dry, choking cough and died completely barely half a mile from her house, right as she turned onto Ashland Avenue, where the snow had already risen to her knees and the entire block lay submerged in the darkness of a power outage. She turned the key 3 times, listening as the engine's weak whine faded like a final breath, then checked her phone. 18% battery remained, and there wasn't a single bar of service. The map inside her head, the one 3 years of delivering food had carved into her memory, told her that Il Faro stood 5 miles north. Selena remained in the car for another 30 seconds, long enough to understand that waiting for roadside assistance in the middle of the storm of the century meant waiting until morning, long enough to think of her father hiding somewhere out there in this cold for 12 days. Then she pulled her zipper up to her chin, hugged the insulated delivery bag against her chest, with the envelope and USB drive wrapped inside 3 layers of plastic, opened the car door, and stepped into the white void. 5 miles through a blizzard was unlike anything she had ever known. The wind threw her sideways at every corner. The snow struck her face like burning sand, and the cold didn't bite its way in from the outside but seemed to grow outward from inside her bones. She walked by memory, guided by landmarks only delivery workers knew. The laundromat with the broad awning that offered shelter from the wind, the alley behind the bakery that was always a few degrees warmer because of the oven vent, the gap in the fence that cut across a parking lot and saved nearly 2,000 feet. By the first mile, she could no longer feel her fingers. As she pushed through the final stretch, she could no longer think of anything except one sentence repeating with every step. Knock on the door. Tell the man there whose daughter you are. Inside Il Faro, at 11:15, Jonah Barone was staring at the second glass of whiskey when he heard someone pounding on the door. It wasn't the knock used by his men, 3 crisp, familiar beats, but a scattered, weakening sound. The 2 men nearest the entrance looked toward the table at the back and waited for an order. Jonah gave a single nod. The heavy door swung open, and the freezing woman who collapsed into his arms was the very delivery girl who would change everything that night. But no version of that story would ever capture the moment immediately afterward, when Jonah knelt on one knee in the middle of the restaurant floor, holding a stranger who was as cold as a breathing block of ice, and felt through her soaked clothing a heartbeat that was fast and uneven, yet stubbornly refused to stop. "Doc Whitman," he called, no louder than his ordinary speaking voice, but the entire room began moving like a machine. Doc Whitman, 55 years old and the Barone family's private physician, emerged from the back room within 40 seconds, carrying a brown leather bag. He knelt beside the girl, lifted her pale hands to examine them, and spoke briefly. Early-stage frostbite in the fingers, possibly the toes as well. "I need warm water, not hot water, and blankets. A lot of blankets." No one asked who the girl was. No one whispered. 100 men from Chicago's underworld moved with precise silence. One dragged an armchair closer to the fireplace. Another brought a basin of warm water. Another retrieved wool blankets from the storage room. And the bartender, a man whose arms were covered in tattoos, personally heated a pot of chicken soup, ladled it into a ceramic mug, and blew across the surface to cool it before handing it over, a gesture he himself couldn't have explained. They removed her shoes. The strips of cloth she had wrapped around her ankles had frozen stiff. Doc Whitman lowered both her hands into the basin and told her not to move her fingers when they began to hurt, because the pain meant the blood vessels were coming back to life. Selena sat swallowed by the armchair, wrapped in 3 layers of blankets, holding the mug of soup between her wrists because her fingers still couldn't grip it, and drank in small sips with the care of someone who understood the value of warmth through having gone without it. Jonah pulled over a wooden chair, placed it exactly 2 steps away from her, and sat facing her. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't rush her. A man who had waited 20 years for a meeting knew how to wait another 10 minutes, and something in the 3 words the girl had whispered at the doorway, in the delivery bag she had clutched so tightly that her knuckles remained white even while she drifted in and out of consciousness, told him those 10 minutes might be worth more than the meeting he had been waiting for. The clock on the wall reached 11 o'clock. Outside, the storm continued to howl. Inside, 100 men stood motionless like a dark forest, all of them waiting for a strange delivery girl to finish her cup of soup. When the cup of soup was more than half empty, and the girl's trembling had eased into occasional shivers that came farther and farther apart, Jonah finally spoke, his voice even and low, as though he were afraid of breaking something fragile in the air. "What is your name?" "Selina," she answered, her breathing still uneven. "Selina Holt. Where did you come from, Selina?" "My car died on Ashland Avenue," she said. "I walked from there." Doc Whitman, who was packing away his medical supplies, jerked his head up. "That is 5 miles," he said. 5 miles on foot in a storm this severe, dressed like that. He didn't finish the rest of the sentence, but his eyes said it for him, that the human body wasn't built to endure such a thing. Jonah never took his eyes off the girl. "What made you walk 5 miles through a blizzard to knock on this door?" he asked. Selina lowered the cup of soup onto her lap, still holding it between her wrists, and looked directly into the eyes of the man the entire city feared. She weighed something inside herself for a second, then made her decision. "My father told me to come," she said. "He left me a letter. He said that if I was ever in real danger, and couldn't trust the people who were supposed to protect me, not the police, not City Hall, then I should come here, knock on the door, and tell the man inside whose daughter I am." The room became so quiet that they could hear snow scraping across the window panes. "Then tell me," Jonah said, "whose daughter are you?" Selina drew a breath. "My father is Frank Holt." Some names fall into a room like coins dropping onto a carpet, unnoticed by everyone. Other names fall like a hammer striking an anvil. Paulie Russo, standing 3 tables away, slowly placed his worn leather notebook on the counter, and anyone who had known him long enough understood that Paulie made that gesture only when the sky was about to collapse. The bartender stopped polishing his glass. Several men near the table at the back instinctively stepped half a pace away, not out of fear, but with the animal instinct that senses a change in the pressure of the air. Because Jonah Barone's face, a face that had revealed nothing to anyone for 20 years, was changing before their eyes, layer by layer, like ice cracking across the surface of a lake. He remained motionless for 3 long seconds, then leaned forward, resting both elbows on his knees, and when he spoke again, his voice had grown 1 degree rougher. "Say his name again." "Frank Holt," Selina said, her voice suddenly quieter because she didn't understand what was happening. "He is 58 years old. He used to work as an insurance appraiser. He has been missing for 12 days, and the police refused to look for him." Jonah's mind instantly flashed back to Paulie's notebook. The missing old man Pharaoh's men had been tracking was no stranger. Jonah closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, Selina saw something inside them that made her forget the pain biting through all 10 of her fingers. Another kind of pain, far older and far deeper. 20 years ago, Jonah said slowly, as though every word had to be carried out of a locked cellar. An apartment building on the south side burned to the ground in the middle of the night. My sister was inside. She was 15 years old. The city report used 2 words, electrical fault, and closed the case in 9 days, as neatly and quickly as someone wiping a stain from a table. But there was one man, exactly one man in that entire system, an insurance appraiser sent to inspect the scene, who refused to sign that conclusion. In his report, he wrote 4 words, possible case of arson, and demanded that the fire be investigated again. 3 weeks later, that report disappeared from the file. He was dismissed for a fabricated reason. His name was removed from every document connected to the fire, and his family left the state. It took me 8 years just to discover that name, Selina. 8 years, only to learn that the man who carried it had vanished from every public record as though he had never existed. He looked at her, and the entire room heard every word. That name was Frank Holt. Selina sat frozen, the soup slowly cooling in her lap as her whole world rearranged itself into an order she had never imagined. Her father, who had spent his life quietly bent over notebooks and maps, had been carrying a secret this heavy for 20 years. He had told her to find this particular man, not because they knew each other, but because a debt owed to the truth had never been paid. She slipped one hand beneath the innermost layer of her clothing, her fingers still clumsy from the cold, pulled out the envelope wrapped in 3 layers of plastic, and placed the small black USB drive, no larger than her thumb, on the table between herself and Jonah. "My father left this behind," she said, "along with a warning not to open it anywhere connected to wireless internet and not to trust my phone. I haven't looked at what is inside, but I think it is the reason he had to go into hiding, and it may be the reason your sister has never been allowed to rest in peace." Jonah stared at the USB drive on the table for 2 seconds, then gave an order without turning his head. "Bring me the laptop from the safe, the one that has never been connected to a network." A man disappeared into the back room and returned carrying a laptop still sealed inside a shielded case. The kind of machine men in Jonah's line of work kept apart for things that could never be allowed to touch the internet. Jonah pushed the 2 glasses of whiskey aside, set the computer down, inserted the USB drive, and Polly and Doc Whitman came to stand behind him while Selena was helped into the chair beside the table, still wrapped in blankets. The screen came to life and revealed a single folder with one simple name, Truth, and inside were 4 numbered files. The first opened into hundreds of carefully scanned pages, building safety inspection reports bearing the seal of the city office, arranged side by side in pairs, the original and the altered version, the same building, the same inspection date, yet with entirely different conclusions. The original stated that the structure met safety standards. The version in the official file declared severe structural damage and ordered the residents removed. Frank Holt had circled every signature, every seal, and every discrepancy in red ink, with the precision of a jeweler. The second file was a map of money moving through shell companies that bought condemned properties for almost nothing, insurance payments issued with unnatural speed, and arrows that passed through 6 or 7 intermediary names, before converging on 2 names. Polly read aloud, his voice heavy as lead, Carmine Farrow and Gerald Pike. "The deputy mayor," Doc Whitman said quietly, and it wasn't a question. 20 years, Jonah said, his eyes still fixed on the screen as one finger moved through page after page. 11 buildings. Thousands of people driven from their homes by forged documents, and no one saw it because the people being pushed aside were the people this city never looked at. Then he opened the 3rd file, and the entire room heard his breath catch. It contained the records of the fire from 20 years earlier, the Southside apartment building, more complete than anything Jonah had uncovered in 2 decades. There was Frank's original report, with the 4 handwritten words, "Possible case of arson," photographs of the scene showing that the fire had begun in a place where no electrical wiring ran at all, and a page of Frank's notes with one sentence underlined twice. This was the first one. They tested it here. Once it worked, they turned it into a system. The first one. Bianca hadn't died in an accident. She had died in an experiment, and the experiment had succeeded so completely that they repeated it 10 more times over the next 20 years. No one in the room dared look directly at Jonah then. He sat motionless before the screen for exactly 5 seconds, his fingers resting on the keyboard without trembling, and it was the absence of that trembling that was most frightening of all. Then he opened the 4th file, the final one, and found it locked behind a password. "Selena," he called. She leaned forward and entered her mother's birthday, and the file opened. Inside was only 1 page, lines Frank had written in haste, his handwriting far more slanted than on the pages before. "They have chosen the next target. Ashland Row House. 300 residents. They won't use fire this time. This time it will be a boiler failure. They are waiting for a storm severe enough to keep the fire engines from arriving in time. A night when everything will look exactly like a natural disaster." Everyone in the room reached the same thought at once, and Polly was the one who spoke it aloud. "Tonight," he said, "half the city is without power, the roads are paralyzed, and there won't be a more perfect night than this one." At the bottom of the page were 2 final lines. The first read, "I am keeping all the original evidence with me. The material on this USB drive is only a copy. Without the originals, no court case will survive their lawyers." The second line was nothing but a handwritten sequence of 14 digits, without explanation or clue. Selena studied the numbers and slowly shook her head. "I don't know what they mean," she said. "They aren't a birthday, they aren't a phone number, and they aren't any address I have ever known." Jonah stood. He closed the laptop, removed the USB drive, handed it back to Selena, and when he turned to face the room, 100 men straightened at once, like a forest shifting before the wind. "The midnight meeting is cancelled," he said, his voice no louder than usual. Yet it fell into the silence like a stone dropping into a well. "Ashland Row House is 4 miles from here. Vehicles won't make it through this storm, and we don't have 4 hours to wait for the roads to clear. Everyone dress warmly. No visible weapons. We walk. Within 3 minutes, Il Faro had transformed into a military camp. The storerooms were opened, and thick coats, wool hats, gloves, flashlights, and ropes were handed out, while Doc Whitman quietly added a large first aid kit and 4 thermal blankets to his backpack. But when Polly spread a paper map across the bar, the problem became clear at once. There wasn't a single bar of service left on any phone. Navigation had died when the city's network collapsed, and the direct route to Ashland Row House crossed 2 major avenues where wind from the lake came roaring through without anything to stop it, where the snow had piled into waves as high as a man's chest. Walking those 4 miles would take 5 hours, assuming no one collapsed along the way. "We don't have 5 hours," Jonah said, and that was when a voice came from beside the fireplace. Not loud, but clear. "I know the way." The entire room turned. Selena had risen from the armchair, the blanket folded neatly over one arm of it, her feet already back inside the shoes that had been dried beside the fire, and she was looking directly at Jonah. "For 3 years, I've delivered food all over the South Side, 12 hours a day," she said. "I know routes that aren't printed on any map. The alley behind the restaurants on 18th Street is protected from the wind almost the entire way. There's a break in the fence at the old printing plant parking lot that leads straight into Pilsen. The abandoned railroad tracks behind the bottling factory run parallel to the avenue, but they sit about 6.5 feet below street level, so the wind passes over your head. Connect those sections. And Ashland Row House is only a little more than 3 miles away, with shelter from the wind for more than half the route." Doc Whitman took 1 step toward her. "You just walked 5 miles and nearly died," he said. "Your hands haven't fully recovered yet." "I know," Selena replied, never taking her eyes off Jonah. "But you won't find those paths without me, even with a map, and there are 300 people sleeping in that building." The room fell silent and waited for the decision. Jonah looked at the small young woman standing in the middle of 100 of his men, her faded dark blue delivery uniform stiff after being dried, her face still pale but her eyes anything but weak, and he gave a single nod. "Bring her the storm lantern from the storeroom," he said, "the oil-burning one that the wind can't blow out." At 11:20 that night, the door of Il Faro opened for the second time, and this time the whole house poured into the storm. Selena stepped out first, the storm lantern in her right hand casting a warm yellow circle of light, a glow so small it seemed absurd against the screaming wall of white, but it burned, and it didn't go out. Directly behind her came Jonah Barone. No bodyguard placed himself between them. Jonah himself walked 1 step from her right shoulder. Then came Polly, then Doc Whitman, then one man after another, 100 black figures leaving the restaurant's light and joining the line, each man placing one hand on the shoulder of the man ahead of him as the order passed down, so no one would become lost in snow, so thick that a person 10 feet away had already disappeared from sight. And so the image took shape. The image the entire city would later repeat like a legend no one could quite believe. A poor delivery girl in a faded uniform walking at the front with a storm lantern in her hand, and behind her, through the worst blizzard in 30 years, the most powerful crime boss in Chicago, and 100 men dressed in black, following in a human chain that stretched into the darkness, silent as a funeral procession, steady as a black river flowing between 2 white banks. No one spoke. There was only the wind, the sound of 100 pairs of boots striking the snow in the same rhythm, and the small yellow glow ahead, leading them all forward. Selena turned into the alley behind the row of restaurants exactly as she had promised, and the wind immediately weakened behind the shelter of the brick walls. She guided the line through the opening in the old printing plant fence, where some of the larger men had to turn sideways to squeeze through. She led them down the slope toward the abandoned tracks, where, just as she had said, the wind could only growl above their heads like an animal trapped outside. Halfway along the tracks, Jonah noticed that the shoulders of the girl in front of him had begun to tremble. Her steps remained even, but both shoulders had drawn inward as she fought the cold. He said nothing. He removed his black wool overcoat, moved alongside her in 2 strides, and settled it across her shoulders without slowing the pace of the line. Selena turned toward him in surprise. "I'm fine," she said. "You need to keep it on." Jonah looked straight ahead, his voice as calm as though they were discussing the weather. "This isn't kindness," he said. "You're the only person here who knows the way. If you fall, all 100 of these men become lost, and no one reaches those 300 people in time. So you have to stay warm. That is a tactical order." Selena looked at the man who had just handed her his heavy coat, while Polly quickly tossed him a spare tactical jacket from the supply bag, understood that arguing would be useless, and pulled the coat, still warm from his body, tightly around her shoulders. She gripped the lantern handle more firmly and quickened her pace by a single step. Behind her, the chain of 100 men immediately moved faster with her, not one link breaking as they crossed the heart of a city dying in the storm, moving toward 300 people who had no idea that their fate that night was being decided by an oil lamp no larger than a fist. The abandoned railroad line ended at an old iron bridge crossing a branch of the canal, the only bridge connecting this low stretch of ground to the neighborhood where Ashland Row House stood, and Selena had already calculated in her head that once they crossed it, less than a mile would remain. But when the group came within roughly 650 feet of the bridge, she stopped so suddenly that Jonah nearly walked into her, then lowered the storm lantern and used her body to shield part of its glow. "There are lights on the bridge," she whispered. Jonah narrowed his eyes and stared through the snow, just as she had said. At the far end of the iron bridge, 2 automobile headlights crossed one another and blocked the way, and within their beams, 4 or 5 figures could be seen leaning against the vehicles, men standing the way people stand when they are being paid to remain there, not the way stranded drivers wait out a storm. Polly slipped forward from behind, watched for half a minute, then spoke very quietly. "Pharaoh's men." I recognized the car. The entire line pressed against the shadowed slope. 100 breaths held at once, and inside that silence, the real question began swelling in every man's mind. In a city brought to a standstill, among hundreds of possible routes leading toward Ashland Row House, why had Pharaoh placed guards at this exact abandoned iron bridge, a passage even local residents had forgotten? "This isn't random security," Polly said, lowering his voice another degree. "If it were random, they would be watching the main roads. Watching this place means they know someone is coming this way. It means they know our route." Jonah stood motionless, snow gathering across the shoulders of his thin shirt, while the mind that had ruled an empire for 20 years began doing what it did best, fitting the pieces together. This route had existed for barely more than an hour, born within the 4 walls of Il Faro, and the people who knew it could be counted on one hand: Jonah, Polly, Doc Whitman, and Selena, the woman who had created it. Selena couldn't be responsible. She had nearly died bringing the warning to them. Doc had served his family for 30 years. Polly was the man Jonah trusted with his life. Then who was the 5th person? The one who knew that Jonah Barone's men would leave Il Faro tonight and head toward Ashland. And at that exact moment, a tiny fragment from earlier that evening rose inside Jonah's mind, so small that no one had thought it worth remembering when it happened. Martin Gable standing beside the fireplace, warming his hands, brushing snow from the shoulders of his overcoat, and asking in that perfectly measured tone of concern, "Are you still keeping the midnight meeting as planned? Or are you moving it somewhere else?" A perfect question. The question an informant had to ask, because before a man could sell his target, he first had to know where the target would be that night. And Gable had left as soon as he received the answer, gone outside toward his telephone, only half an hour before Selena knocked on the door, and every plan shifted toward Ashland. But what did the change matter? Gable's man had still been inside that room. No, Jonah corrected his own reasoning. Colder now, more precise. He didn't need another man at all. Gable knew about Frank Holt, the unfamiliar name in Polly's notebook, the retired appraiser asking questions about reports 2 decades old, who had handled every compensation document for the Barone family after the fire 20 years earlier with suspicious speed, who had advised Jonah's devastated mother to accept the money and stop pursuing the case, who had become the family's trusted attorney from that moment forward, allowed into every room and permitted to hear every plan. Anyone trying to bury an arson report needed someone in the middle, someone wearing a fine suit, speaking politely, able to move between City Hall and the families of the victims. Martin Gable wasn't the Barone family's attorney. Martin Gable was the jailer assigned to watch the Barone family, and he had been watching them for 20 years. Polly was staring at his boss, and what he saw made him, a man who had survived every kind of bloodshed, swallow hard. Jonah didn't roar. Jonah didn't strike the bridge railing. He simply stood there, perfectly still beneath the falling snow, and his anger revealed itself in the most terrifying way possible, by revealing nothing at all. Only his eyes changed, like 2 windows whose lights had just been extinguished from within. "Gable," he said, Only one word. And Polly gave a slow nod. I just arrived at the same thought. Selina looked between the two men, not understanding everything, but understanding enough to know that somewhere within their ranks, a name had just died in a certain sense. Jonah turned toward her, and his voice had returned to a calm so complete it was frightening. They know this route, but they don't know you, he said. The entire south side is inside your head. Give me another way. Selina closed her eyes for 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds the entire map of the south side unfolded behind her eyelids. Every alley, every gap in a fence, every unlocked door. Then she opened her eyes. There is one way, she said. The old Maxwell Street Market. Beneath the row of abandoned warehouses, there is an underground passage running all the way through. Merchants used it years ago to move goods between stalls during the winter. Now, only delivery workers like us know about it. We crawl through there to cut across the neighborhood whenever the snow gets heavy. It comes out directly in the streets behind Ashland Row House. They could guard 100 bridges and still never see that route. But the entrance is almost half a mile west of here, in the opposite direction, and if the entire group turns around, the men on the bridge will see the lights moving. Jonah nodded, and his strategic mind needed only 10 seconds. Then they will see exactly what they want to see, he said, before turning to Polly. Take 30 men, keep the formation loose, and carry most of the flashlights. Move toward the bridge very slowly. Stop, retreat, then advance again. Make it look as though we are hesitating and trying to find a way across. They will keep their eyes on you and call their employer with reports. Do not engage them. Do not step onto the bridge. Just make yourselves as large and visible in their eyes as possible for as long as you can. Polly looked at his boss, then at the delivery girl, and for one very brief moment, the hard man gave a smile so faint it was almost invisible. The men on that bridge are going to have a long night, he said, then turned away to choose his people. 30 dark figures separated from the line, took the lights, and began moving toward the bridge like a slow swarm of fireflies, deliberately clumsy in their advance. The remaining 70 men extinguished nearly every light, leaving only Selina's storm lantern, partly covered by the fold of a coat, and followed her silently west. The entrance to the underground passage was a crooked wooden door, behind a row of abandoned stalls, looking like the entrance to a storage shed filled with scrap. Selina slipped one hand into a crack in the wall and lifted the inner latch with the ease of long habit, and the door opened onto a concrete staircase leading beneath the ground. Below, the passage was wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, its ceiling low, its air still and strangely warmer than the surface above. The storm overhead had faded into a distant hum, like the sound of the sea trapped inside a shell. 70 men followed one another through the single pool of yellow light cast by Selina's lantern, and for the first time since leaving Il Faro, they could speak without shouting. Jonah walked directly behind her, watching the way she turned without hesitation at each black intersection, and he asked, "How do you know this place so well?" Selina didn't turn around, and her voice echoed softly against the concrete walls. 3 years. 12 hours a day, she said. When you deliver food, people pay for speed. No one pays for who you are. So I learned the city instead of learning how to be noticed. I know the back entrance of every building, which security guards will let you use the service elevator, which streets flood when it rains, and which ones become blocked when there is a game. People look straight through me as though I were glass, and after a while I realized that was a kind of power. Invisible people can go places other people can't. She gave a small shrug. I just never imagined it would be useful on a night like this. Jonah remained silent for several steps. I understand that feeling from the opposite direction, he said. This entire city sees me everywhere, but what they see is only a shadow they drew themselves, a name they use to frighten one another over drinks. For 20 years, no one has truly seen me either. It is still invisibility, only a different kind. Selina looked back for the first time, and within the yellow glow of the lantern, the two of them held each other's gaze for 1 second, the girl no one had ever bothered to see and the man no one had ever dared to see. Then she said, "So tonight, we are even. I see you, and you see me." She turned forward and continued walking, while Jonah watched the small figure ahead of him inside his oversized coat, aware that something had shifted inside his chest, something he didn't have time to name, because Selina had already raised one hand to signal a stop. "The tunnel ends here," she whispered. "These stairs lead up to the garbage yard behind the neighborhood. From there, We cross one playground and reach the back of Ashland row house. She lifted the iron door above them just enough to create a narrow opening, and cold wind forced its way inside along with the roar of the storm. Through that gap, they both saw it. A 6-floor red brick building lying silent beneath the snow, a few windows still glowing faintly with candlelight, 300 people asleep inside, none of them knowing that beneath their feet, in the boiler room, someone else's clock was counting down. Jonah looked at his watch. It was 12:40 in the morning. "Go," he said. The plan was passed down the line in short, precise instructions before they crossed the snow-covered playground. The public high school gymnasium, exactly 2 blocks from Ashland Row House, was the city's official storm shelter, equipped with a generator and heat, and open that night to families who had lost power. That was where the 300 residents would be taken. "No panic," Jonah ordered. "No one says the word fire or the word explosion. A terrified crowd trapped in a dark stairwell will kill people faster than that boiler ever could. Knock on every door. Say there is a gas emergency, and the city has ordered a temporary evacuation to the gymnasium. Help the elderly dress warmly. Carry sleeping children. Bring their medication for them. Use the stairs. 2 men for every household." And so 300 people were awakened in the middle of the blizzard by calm knocks at their doors, and when they opened them, they found enormous men dressed in black speaking with an almost unnatural gentleness. "Sorry to disturb you, ma'am. Do you need to bring your heart medication? Sir, let me carry that bag for you. Leave the child asleep. I'll carry him on my shoulder." None of the residents knew who these men were. A few of the oldest among them vaguely recognized faces they had once seen in the newspapers, and wisely decided not to ask questions. The stream of people moved quietly down the stairwells, through the lobby, and out the rear entrance, where Polly's team, having slipped away from their performance at the bridge at the appointed time, stood along the path like a living wall against the wind, guiding each group across the 2 blocks toward the glow of the gymnasium. 40 minutes. 5 floors. 299 people. Then Doc Whitman came running down from the 3rd floor to find Jonah. "One person remains," he said. "Room 304. The old woman refuses to leave. My team has been pleading with her for 10 minutes, but she only sits there." Jonah went up to the 3rd floor with Selena. Room 304 was small and clean, warm with the lingering scent of old tea, and in the middle of it, seated upright in a worn armchair, was an elderly woman wearing a cardigan buttoned all the way to her throat, her age-spotted hands wrapped tightly around a rectangular tin box resting on her lap. "Mrs. Halloran," the evacuation team leader whispered to Jonah. 74 years old. She has lived here since the building was first constructed. Her husband died last year. Jonah stepped inside, and the old woman looked up at him without the slightest trace of fear, her pale blue eyes clouded by time but still direct. "You are the one commanding all these young men, aren't you?" she said. "Then listen carefully. I am not going anywhere. I know you mean well, but I am 74 years old, and I am no longer afraid to die." She looked down at the tin box on her lap, her thumb gently brushing the chipped paint on its lid. "Inside this box is my wedding photograph with Mr. Halloran from 52 years ago, and one photograph from every year that came after. He died in this very room, in that bed, holding my hand. My whole life is inside these 4 walls, young man. If I leave, who will remember?" she said, and her voice did not tremble, though her eyes filled with tears. "Once I am gone, who will remember for me that he ever lived in this room, that he slept in that bed?" The men standing in the doorway lowered their eyes to their shoes. Selena raised one hand to her mouth. Then, before all of them, Jonah Barone, the man no one in Chicago dared look directly in the eyes, slowly lowered himself onto one knee before the armchair so that his face was level with the old woman's, and when he spoke, his voice carried a roughness none of his men had ever heard before. "Ma'am," he said, 20 years ago, in a building much like this one, my 15-year-old sister had already made it to the stairwell, but she refused to leave our mother's photograph album behind. She went back for it." He paused, and the entire room could hear the snow against the window. "She never came out again," he said. "For 20 years, I have lived with one lesson, ma'am. Memories survive only as long as the person carrying them survives. This room doesn't remember your husband. You do. So you are coming with me, and I swear to you on my sister's name that this box will come with you in my hands and will not leave my side for even half a step." Mrs. Halloran studied the man kneeling before her for a long moment, and saw in his dark eyes an old wound nearly as aged as the photographs inside her tin box. Then she gave one very small nod, and held the box out to him. Jonah received it with both hands, as carefully as though he were being handed an infant, then rose and offered her his other arm for support. When they reached the lobby, the men dressed in black moved aside to form a path, and without a word passing among them, every one of them bowed his head as the old woman walked by, not in respect for their boss, but in respect for her. At the door, Mrs. Halloran held Selina's arm, and the snow was still falling, but for that 2-block journey through the storm, 100 men stood against the wind for an old woman and a tin box, holding 52 years of love and remembrance. While Mrs. Halloran was being guided through the doors of the gymnasium, the remaining work of that night was being handled in the basement of Ashland Row House, with the efficiency of professionals. Polly led 8 men down the rear stairwell, and what happened inside the boiler room unfolded so cleanly that the last residents leaving the building never knew a thing. 3 strangers crouched over the pressure valve system, looked up to find themselves surrounded by 3 times as many dark figures, and faced with expressions as cold as steel and a suggestion delivered in a very quiet voice. All 3 made the only sensible choice. They raised their hands, dropped to their knees, and remained silent. There was no gunfire, and not a single drop of blood, only the sound of plastic restraints tightening around wrists, and Polly breathing out slowly as he personally returned the valves to their safe positions, then disconnected the timer clumsily wired into the pressure sensor, a device designed to turn the entire basement into a steam bomb at 4 o'clock in the morning and leave 3 clean words on the official report: boiler system failure. The oldest of the 3 men, who wore a technician's uniform bearing the logo of a real maintenance company, broke after only 5 minutes under Polly's stare. He admitted that they had been hired through 2 layers of intermediaries, paid in cash, with no paperwork, but the final order, the instruction confirming the activation time for that night, had come through a telephone call. The voice belonged to an older man who spoke in the elaborate manner of a lawyer. He remembered it clearly, because the man had used a phrase no working man would ever use. He repeated the phrase, and Polly and Jonah looked at each other across the basement. It was one of Martin Gable's favorite expressions, the kind of flowery language he had scattered through every document he had prepared for the Barone family over the past 20 years. A second loop tightened around that name. But Jonah knew it still wasn't enough. The testimony of a hired hand identifying a voice over the telephone would be torn apart in 10 minutes inside a courtroom. To bring down Farrow, Pike, and Gable, they needed what Frank Holt was carrying with him, the original evidence, and Frank was somewhere out there on the 12th night of his flight, alone in the middle of this storm. Back in the building's now empty lobby, Jonah spread the sheet, bearing Frank's sequence of numbers across the security desk, 14 handwritten digits, and the sharpest minds among his men gathered around it. "It doesn't match the format of coordinates," one man said. "It isn't a bank account," said another. "It wasn't a court file number, a license plate, or a driver's license number." Doc Whitman tried arranging the digits into dates, while Polly divided them into pairs and groups of 3, but the sequence remained there in silence as the clock moved steadily toward 1 o'clock in the morning, and every passing minute was another minute Frank Holt remained alone somewhere outside. Selina stood at the edge of the group, her eyes fixed on the digits, while something kept scratching faintly at the border of her memory. A strange familiarity, not the recognition of numbers she had seen before, but the recognition of a rhythm, the way the sequence broke apart. 2 digits, then 4, then 6, then the final 2, and suddenly both her hands turned cold for a reason that had nothing to do with the winter. "That isn't a code," she said, and the entire lobby turned toward her. "It is a delivery order number." She stepped forward, one trembling finger tracing each cluster of digits. "The old system used by the delivery company where my father worked part-time after losing his job structured its order numbers exactly this way. The first 2 digits are the regional code. The next 4 are the date code. The following 6 are the package sequence number. And the final 2 are the courier's confirmation code." She looked up, her eyes already filled with tears even though her voice struggled to remain steady. "This wasn't just any delivery. I know exactly which one it was. It was the first delivery I ever made, when I was 16. My father took me along in the truck for summer training. He logged that exact order number in his personal journal under my daughter's first delivery, and taught me to always remember that destination. The address was a crate of old religious objects delivered to the basement of St. Adalbert Church. She swallowed. It was a crate of old religious objects delivered to the basement of St. Adalbert Church, the church in Pilsen that has been closed and abandoned for years. Only my father and I knew about that delivery, and he knew the church basement had been abandoned for years, making it the perfect hideout. No record of it still exists, and no one else in the world could ever trace it. My father didn't leave a code for strangers to solve. He left a memory only his daughter could unlock. Jonah looked at her, and inside his chest, the feeling he hadn't had time to name in the underground passage shifted another step. "How far is St. Adalbert?" he asked. 12 minutes on foot, Selina answered. "I'll lead the way." She lifted the storm lantern, and this time, no one needed to give an order. The entire line had already formed behind her. St. Adalbert Church emerged through the curtain of snow like a ship run aground. Its 2 dark bell towers etched against the gray sky, its stained glass windows boarded over for years, and the chain-link fence surrounding it little more than a formality to anyone who knew where the wire had been cut. And Selina knew. She led Jonah and the others around to the side door sheltered from the wind, the same entrance where she and her father had once carried the package downstairs. And when she pushed against the heavy wooden door, its hinges released a long groan into the darkness. The stone staircase leading to the basement was still there, and from the very first steps, the light from Selina's storm lantern swept across something that made her heart seize. Empty food cans arranged in a neat row along the foot of the wall, lined up with the same careful order her father had brought to everything in his life. "Dad!" she called, her voice breaking open in the depths of the cellar. And from a dark corner beyond the row of stone columns came the faintest rustling sound, followed by a voice so weak it was barely a voice at all. "Selina, is that you?" She rushed down the final steps. Frank Holt sat with his back against the base of a column, wrapped in 2 old blankets and a tarpaulin, his gaunt face covered with 12 days of gray stubble, his lips cracked, his eyes sunken deep but brightening when he saw his daughter, and across his lap, held tightly in both arms even in exhaustion, rested a gray fireproof document safe. Selina dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around her father, and the 58-year-old man began to tremble in his daughter's embrace, one freezing hand clumsily stroking her hair. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." Doc Whitman was beside them at once, checking his pulse, pressing a hand to his forehead. "Moderate hypothermia, dehydration, severe exhaustion," he said quickly. "He needs to be warmed gradually and given fluids. But he'll be all right. I need 2 men and the thermal blankets." One corner of the basement was turned into a makeshift medical station. Flashlights were propped upright, and 100 men in black spread into a wide arc around the father and daughter, utterly silent, like 100 statues guarding an altar. When warmth and sugared water had drawn Frank close enough to life again, he finally raised his head and looked over his daughter's shoulder at the tall man who had been standing silently beyond the circle of light all that time. And something strange happened. Frank Holt didn't ask who he was. He studied Jonah for a long moment, then spoke slowly and unevenly, each short sentence requiring a pause for breath. "I knew you would come. I've been waiting for you. For 20 years. Jonah stepped into the light. "You know who I am?" he asked. Frank gave a weak nod, and a weary smile crossed his hollow face. "The Barone boy," he said, 16 years old, standing barefoot on the sidewalk. "I was there that night too, behind the fire line. I saw you watching the flames." He had to stop and breathe. "I was the appraiser sent there the next morning. I found the point where the fire began. I knew it wasn't an electrical fault. I wrote it in my report. Then they took the report from me. They took my job too. They even took my name out of the records." He looked down at the safe resting on his lap. "I could have stayed silent. For the rest of my life. My wife was sick. My daughter was small. Silence meant safety. But that barefoot boy never left my mind. And neither did that girl, 15 years old. I never met her, but I owed her." Frank looked up again, and his sunken eyes filled with tears. "Every year, on that exact date, I sent flowers to her grave. I never dared sign my name. 20 years, 20 bouquets. Did you ever wonder, Mr. Barone? White flowers, from a cowardly old man trying to become brave a little at a time." The basement fell silent. Jonah Barone stood perfectly still. The man who hadn't shed a single tear in front of anyone for 20 years. Not since the night he had stood barefoot on that sidewalk, because he had sworn the city would never see him weak. For 20 years, he had gone alone to his sister's grave, and for 20 years, he had found that nameless bouquet of white flowers waiting there. He had once ordered men to watch the grave. He had wondered. Eventually, he had stopped wondering, and now he understood that for 2 decades, somewhere in the world, a stranger had been carrying Bianca's death beside him. An old man quietly gathering one sheet of paper after another in the dark, trying to repay a debt to a girl he had never even met. Jonah's shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly. He turned his face away from the light toward the darkness beyond the stone columns, and stood there with his back to everyone, both hands tightening into fists, then slowly releasing. Not one of the 100 men dared breathe too loudly. Only Selena, still kneeling beside her father, quietly rose, walked up behind Jonah, and placed her bandaged hand on his shoulder, as lightly as settling snow. She said nothing. Nothing needed to be said. In the basement of an abandoned church, in the middle of that storm-torn night, the 20-year debt of 2 strangers had finally found its way home, and between them rested the gray safe, holding inside it the cleanest weapon Chicago's underworld had ever touched: the truth. They left St. Adalbert at nearly 2 o'clock in the morning, with Frank carried on a stretcher fashioned from 2 planks and supported by 4 powerful arms, while Jonah carried the gray safe himself. The group had barely reached the edge of Pilsen when Polly raised a clenched fist and signaled everyone to stop. Against the northern sky, through the curtain of snow that had begun to thin, a beam of light swept across the darkness. Not a streetlight, but a cold white glare moving in a wide arc, and then they all heard it, the blades of a helicopter cutting through the night air. One of the younger men still had access to the police frequency on a crackling handheld radio, and he turned pale as he called Polly over. "Everyone needs to hear this," he said, then raised the volume. The dispatcher's voice came through the static. "Emergency citywide warrant issued for Jonah Barone, 36 years old, leader of an armed group estimated at approximately 100 men, suspected of forcibly and unlawfully removing the entire population of Ashland Row House during the night. Possible hostage situation. Subject considered armed and extremely dangerous. All units seal off the south side under Protocol 4. The radio dissolved into static again, and the entire group stood frozen in the snow. "They have turned the whole thing against us," Polly said, his voice tightening with outrage. "We evacuated 300 people from a death trap, and they have made us into kidnappers." Jonah remained still, and inside his mind, the chessboard revealed itself with merciless clarity. When the performance at the Iron Bridge collapsed, and no word came back from the Ashland basement, Gable had understood that he was exposed, and an old fox who had survived for 20 years had never done so through luck. He had played his final piece, called Pike, and Pike, who held the entire machinery of the city in his hands, needed only one telephone call to turn truth into a crime and rescuers into kidnappers, because in the eyes of this city, between the word of a deputy mayor and the word of a mafia boss, who would be believed? On the rooftops of several distant buildings, police searchlights began raising white pillars into the sky, gradually forming a cage around the south side. "Get everyone inside the old bottling plant," Jonah ordered. "Spread out and extinguish every light." Inside that cold, abandoned factory, beneath rows of broken windows, the shortest and heaviest meeting of his life began. "We have 2 paths left," Polly said directly, without softening a single word. "The first is the way we have always lived. I bring Gable here within the hour. He confesses everything on camera. Then he disappears. I will take care of Pharaoh. He understands the laws of this world. We keep that safe as insurance. No courts, no newspapers, no placing our fate in the hands of the same system that betrayed you 20 years ago and branded you a kidnapper tonight. The second path is to hand the safe over to that very system and pray." The faces around Jonah waited, and every man knew which direction their boss was leaning. For 20 years, this man had been shaped for this exact moment, for the day when he could finally close his own hands around the throats of those who had killed his sister, and now they had given him the perfect justification. They had declared war first. Jonah looked down at the gray safe beside his feet, and in the darkness, his voice emerged deep and cold as water beneath ice. "For 20 years, he said, I have spared this system long enough. It took my sister from me. It took Mr. Holt's name from him, and tonight, it nearly took 300 more lives. Men like Pharaoh and Pike aren't afraid of courts. They feed the courts. They fear only one thing, what I am holding in my hands, in both senses of the phrase." He bent down and lifted the safe, and the entire factory held its breath, because in that moment, Jonah Barone stood precisely on the boundary he had spent 20 years walking toward, and the darkness on the other side had opened its door to welcome him home. Then a voice rose from beside the stretcher. It wasn't Frank's voice. It was Selina's. At some point, she had stood up, still wearing Jonah's oversized black wool coat, and she walked forward until she stood directly before the most dangerous man in Chicago, so close that the people around them nearly reached out to pull her back. "I have no right to tell you what to do," she said, her voice quiet but every word clear inside the empty factory. "My father gave 20 years and nearly his life for the papers inside that safe. So I am only asking you to listen to me for 1 minute. You kill Gable, you bury Pharaoh, and you win. I believe you will win. But what happens afterward? Bianca will still lie inside an official file beneath the words electrical fault. My father will still be dismissed as a confused old man inventing stories. Those 300 people will never know what nearly killed them tonight, and those 11 buildings will remain 11 accidents." She looked directly into his eyes and spoke the words he would remember for the rest of his life. "If you settle this through darkness, Bianca receives only revenge. If you settle it through light, her honor is restored, and those 300 people are given their homes back." Jonah remained motionless for a long time after those words, the gray safe weighing heavily in his hands while the entire abandoned bottling plant waited in the darkness. Then he placed the safe on a rusted steel table, unlocked it, and looked at the stacks of documents Frank had carefully wrapped in plastic, one bundle at a time. When he raised his head again, his eyes had changed. They were no longer the eyes of a man standing before the doorway to darkness, but the eyes of a chess player who had just seen a third move no one else on the board had imagined. "You are half right," he told Selina, "and Polly is right about the other half. This system is rotten. Handing the safe to one agency would be the same as feeding it into a paper shredder. But you are right about the light, so we won't light a single lamp. We will light the entire city at once, so there won't be a hand large enough to cover it all." He turned toward his men and began issuing orders with the rhythm his people knew from nights when life and death hung in the balance. "Find me a photocopier, a scanner, anything that still works. There is a print shop owned by someone we know on Blue Island Avenue. Wake the owner. Pay him 10 times the usual rate. I need 40 complete copies of every document inside this safe before 4 o'clock in the morning. Each copy packed separately, sealed, and numbered." Then he looked at Selina. "And the rest of the plan belongs to you. 40 packages need 40 couriers. The police won't stop, won't suspect, and won't even bother to look at. People who can pass through a city under lockdown the way water slips through cracks in stone. How many people like that do you know?" Selina understood immediately, and for the first time that night, she smiled. She borrowed Polly's satellite phone, and beginning at 3 o'clock in the morning, inside the abandoned factory, she started calling one name after another from 3 years of memories on the road, co-workers who had shared loaves of bread at 2 o'clock in the morning, pushed one another's broken-down cars, and covered one another's late shifts. On the other end of the line, the most exhausted people in the city woke one by one and listened as she said, "It is Selina. I need a special delivery. It is not for me. It is for 300 people who nearly died tonight, and for everyone who won't have to die in the years ahead. Is it dangerous? Maybe. Will you be paid? Yes. But I won't lie to you and say this is an ordinary delivery." And Chicago's delivery workers, the people whose faces the city had never bothered to remember, answered one after another with the same single word, yes. At 4 o'clock in the morning, the snow had weakened into thin, scattered threads, and from the back door of the print shop on Blue Island Avenue, 40 people wearing every kind of delivery uniform spread out in 40 directions. Some rode bicycles, some walked, and some drove battered old cars fitted with familiar delivery boxes, so ordinary that every checkpoint waved them through without bothering to ask a question, because who would ever stop a delivery worker in the middle of a snowstorm? Package number 1 reached the regional FBI office and was placed directly into the hands of the employee on duty, with the word urgent written across the cover. Package number 2 arrived at the private home of Lieutenant Dana Kowalski, the female police officer Frank's records identified as the first investigator assigned to the fire 20 years earlier, the one who had requested that the case be reopened, only to be silenced by her superiors, transferred, and forgotten. Her package included a handwritten note from Jonah containing a single sentence. "You were right 20 years ago. Now it is time to prove it." The remaining packages went to every newsroom in the city, the major newspapers, television stations, radio stations, online news outlets, even the smallest neighborhood papers, without leaving out a single name, so that no powerful telephone call could possibly reach them all in time. This city had spent years making delivery workers invisible, and on that fateful night, it was those invisible people who delivered the truth. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the worst blizzard in 30 years officially came to an end. The sun had not yet risen, but the eastern sky had begun to glow with the pale brightness of steel, and inside the abandoned bottling plant, the crackling radio was turned as high as it would go when the first morning broadcast began. The news anchor's voice trembled because of the words she was about to read. "We are interrupting our regular programming because a shocking collection of documents was delivered to our newsroom during the night. At the same time, it was sent to every news organization in the city. Ladies and gentlemen, 20 years, 11 buildings, 3 fires, and 1 deputy mayor." Inside the factory, no one cheered. 100 men merely looked quietly at one another. Frank Holt closed his eyes on the stretcher as 2 tears rolled across his hollow cheeks, while Jonah Barone stood beside Selena Holt at the broken window, looking toward the brightening horizon, where their city had just awakened and begun to shake. What unfolded over the weeks that followed was watched by all of Chicago like a landslide moving in slow motion, unstoppable once it had begun. The warrant issued for Jonah collapsed before the first morning was over, when the 300 residents of Ashland Row House, eating breakfast inside the warm gymnasium, told the reporters flooding in that no one had kidnapped them, that the men dressed in black had knocked politely, carried bags of medication, and lifted sick residents onto their backs to bring them down the stairs. Mrs. Halloran, sitting upright before the cameras with the tin box resting on her lap, spoke one sentence that was replayed again and again across every channel. "They tell me those men are criminals. All I know is that last night this entire city abandoned us, and they came." Gerald Pike chose to fight back with an emergency press conference at City Hall, standing before a forest of microphones, with the expression of a man falsely accused, calling the entire collection of evidence a fabrication created by organized criminals to disgrace the government. He had just reached the words, "I have devoted my entire life to this city," when the door behind the press room opened and Lieutenant Dana Kowalski entered with federal agents. She walked directly to the podium before dozens of cameras broadcasting live and announced the arrest warrant. The moment Pike was placed in handcuffs on live television, halfway through a denial he never finished, became the most watched image on Chicago television that year, because 20 years earlier, Kowalski had been the young female investigator whose work he had crushed with his authority. And fate sometimes possesses a very particular sense of humor. Carmine Farrow didn't wait for his own handcuffs to appear before the cameras. He attempted to leave the state aboard his private plane that same afternoon, but the flight manifest had been on the agent's desk since morning, and he was stopped at the foot of the aircraft stairs. In the months that followed, he faced a federal indictment under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Every shell company, every trail of money, and every signature Frank Holt had circled in red over 20 years now formed a prison of paper around him, sealed so tightly that even the most expensive legal team in the state had no choice but to negotiate the length of his sentence. As for Martin Gable, the old fox smelled the ashes before anyone else. During the first week, he appeared voluntarily at the federal prosecutor's office with his own attorney and offered to reveal everything in exchange for leniency. His testimony, coming from the man who had stood at the center of every transaction for 2 decades, became the final nail driven into the coffin of the entire operation. Before Gable was transferred to a protected facility for cooperating witnesses, he asked to see Jonah once, and the meeting took place in a visitation room divided by glass, 10 minutes long and recorded as required by law. Gable sat down visibly thinner in a suit that no longer fit him, and spoke in the elaborate language that had become instinctive. "You have to understand, I had no choice back then. They had something on me. I was only a pawn too." Jonah looked at the man who had eaten at his family's table for 20 years, who had placed a hand on his shoulder at his mother's funeral, and he didn't strike the table or lower his voice into a threat. He only spoke very slowly, allowing each word to pass through the glass. "I used to think that when this day came, I would need to see you on your knees," he said. "But sitting here and looking at you, I realize I don't need anything at all, because prison isn't your punishment, Gable. Prison doors eventually open. Your punishment is that from this day until the end of your life, no one will ever fear you again. No door will need you to knock on it. No secret will need you to keep it. You will be nothing more than an old man who betrayed everyone who trusted him. And whenever people speak your name, they will lower their voices, not out of respect, but out of contempt." Then he stood, tapped 2 fingers lightly against the glass as one might tap the lid of a box already sealed, and walked away without looking back, leaving Martin Gable alone with a sentence no court could ever impose. But for Jonah, the most important judgment of that entire winter didn't take place at City Hall or inside a federal courtroom. It came late one afternoon during the 6 o'clock news, when the prosecutor's office announced the findings of the reopened investigation into the South Side fire from 20 years earlier, overturned the conclusion of electrical fault, officially determined that the building had been deliberately set on fire, and read the names of the dead as victims of murder. Among them was Bianca Barone, 15 years old. Jonah stood alone before the television, in the back room of Il Faro when her name was spoken. He stood perfectly straight and perfectly still, as though the smallest movement might cause something inside his chest to spill beyond his control. Paulie, the only man who dared enter the room at that moment, said nothing. He simply walked over and placed one hand on his boss's shoulder, and the 2 men remained that way for a very long time, before the blue light of the screen gradually blurred, listening as the city outside finally spoke their sister's true name for the first time in 20 years. Spring came late to Chicago, as it did every year, and by the time the last piles of snow had melted from the sidewalks of the South Side, Frank Holt had reached the end of his recovery. 12 days in that frozen basement had taken much of his strength, but they hadn't taken the thing he valued most. One April afternoon, he sat with his daughter on the front steps of their small house, the 2 of them drinking coffee in the pale sunlight, silent for a long while in the way of people who had passed through a storm together. Then Frank set down his cup and said what he had owed his daughter for far too long. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," he said. "All my life, I could have chosen differently. They once offered me a great deal of money to remain silent, enough that your mother wouldn't have had to lie in a shared hospital room, enough that you wouldn't have had to glue the soles of your shoes back together, or count every dollar of your tips alone in the car at night. I knew all of it. I saw all of it, and I still chose clean hands over full pockets. And because of that, my daughter had to spend the finest years of her life in poverty." He lowered his eyes to his hands, where the first marks of age had begun to appear. "Some nights, I asked myself whether I had been selfish, protecting my conscience while making my wife and child pay the price." Selena set down her coffee, turned toward him, and looked directly into his face. She answered without a second of hesitation. "Look at me, Dad," she said. "That night, I stood before the most frightening door in this city, exhausted, without a dollar in my pocket, and without a single person behind me, and I didn't bow my head. I looked the most powerful man in Chicago straight in the eyes and told him the truth. Do you know why? Because I'm the daughter of a man who wouldn't sell his signature. You didn't leave me money. You left me a name that never has to lower itself before anyone. That is the greatest inheritance you could ever have given me." Frank Holt turned his face toward the sunlit street, and the man who hadn't broken in 20 years allowed his shoulders to tremble. A few days later, on the first Sunday morning in May, Jonah came for Selena in his private car without telling her where they were going. He drove through familiar streets until the car stopped outside the gates of a cemetery on the western edge of the city, a place where he had never brought anyone in 20 years. Even Paulie had only ever been allowed to wait beyond the gates. They walked beneath the old elm trees, passing rows of stone markers, until they stopped before a small grave that had been carefully tended. Bianca Barone's name was carved into the stone, along with 2 dates separated by only 15 years. And at the foot of the marker, just as there had been for 2 decades, lay a bouquet of white flowers that had begun to wilt, the final bouquet Frank had sent before he disappeared. Selena knelt and placed the flowers she had brought beside them, the same white blossoms. She had asked her father their name, and now she whispered something so softly to the grave that Jonah couldn't hear it, and he didn't ask. When she stood, he looked at his sister's resting place for a long time before speaking, his voice low and slow. "I spent 20 years learning how to take revenge," he said. "I built an empire one brick at a time, so that one day I would be powerful enough to collect what was owed. Then you walked through my door in the middle of a storm, and in a single night, you taught me how to repay a debt instead. To 300 strangers, to an old man I had never met, and even to the girl lying here. It turns out the greatest debt of my life was never mine to collect. It was mine to repay." He said nothing more, and neither did Selena. Only the May wind moved through the branches above them, making patches of sunlight tremble across the two names carved in stone. Then, somewhere inside that silence, Selena's hand found Jonah's, or his found hers. Neither of them knew exactly which, and neither needed to know. They only knew that their hands closed around each other for the first time in front of Bianca, and they remained that way for a very long time. That summer, scaffolding rose around Ashland Row House. The court returned the building to its residents, and the largest renovation in its history began. Funding came from a newly established organization called the Bianca Foundation, created to transform the property into decent homes at prices working people could afford, with priority given to the former residents who wished to return. On the first day the apartments were handed back that fall, before the cameras of the same newspapers that had received those packages during the blizzard, the first person given a key was Mrs. Halloran, now 75 years old. She returned to room 304, now warm with a new heating system, and when the reporters followed her inside, the first thing she did wasn't answer their questions. She slowly placed the tin box on the brand new mantel, adjusted it until it sat perfectly straight, and only then turned around and smiled. At the far end of the hallway, standing unnoticed among the crowd without badges or cameras, Jonah and Selena looked at each other, and neither of them needed to say that the storm that night had, in the end, brought everyone home. 1 year later, winter returned to Chicago, and on a January afternoon, the city radio stations once again broadcast a warning of a major blizzard, the kind of warning that had once left the entire South Side shivering in darkness and praying. But this year, no one needed to pray, because before the season had even begun, the Bianca Foundation had completed an emergency response system so effective that city officials were sent to study it. Warming shelters had been prepared in advance with generators, blankets, and bedding. Lists of elderly residents living alone in every neighborhood had been updated down to each house number, and a fleet of dark blue supply vehicles waited in the lot, fully fueled and loaded with food, medicine, and portable heaters. Coordinating the entire system was a 28-year-old woman who had just completed a supply chain management certification through a scholarship funded by the foundation, a woman whom elderly residents throughout the South Side now greeted with an affectionate name whenever she entered a room, the girl with the lantern. That afternoon, before the first snowflakes began to fall, the supply vehicles formed a long line across the lot, their engines humming steadily. Among the 20 drivers were many familiar faces who had delivered the 40 packages of truth on that stormy night a year earlier, along with the men in black from Il Faro, now wearing the foundation's reflective jackets over their coats, all of them standing beside their vehicles and waiting. At the front of the line, beside the vehicle marked number 1, Jonah Barone stood ready, and when Selena emerged from the coordination office, carrying a list of every destination and the old storm lantern she had kept all these years, like a faithful companion, he opened the passenger door for her. She paused before him for a moment, smiled, and spoke 3 words that neither of them would ever hear the way anyone else did. "Follow me." The convoy began to move, one vehicle after another, leaving the lot beneath the gray afternoon sky, their headlights forming a long necklace of light winding through streets, slowly turning white, spreading toward homes where people were waiting. This time, no one in the city would have to walk 5 miles through a blizzard to find help, because help had learned how to find its own way to every door. The story of that night, of the poor delivery girl and the most powerful man in Chicago, would be told for many years, and each time it was told, it would remind us of one simple truth that life makes so easy to forget. Never judge a person by the uniform they wear or the reputation the world has placed upon them, because the girl the entire city had looked through as though she were glass turned out to be the only one who knew the way, while the man the entire city called a monster turned out to be the only one willing to walk into the storm. Kindness has never lived in status, money, or appearances. It lives in whether we are willing to step forward when someone needs us. Truth is the same. Even when buried for 20 years beneath power and lies, it waits patiently for someone brave enough to bend down and uncover it. Sometimes that person is only an old man bent over stacks of documents. Sometimes it is a young woman willing to knock on a door no one else dares approach. And when people learn to respect one another, to truly see one another instead of looking through each other, even hearts thought to have turned to stone can grow warm again, and wounds carried for 20 years can finally begin to heal. If today's story touched your heart, please press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with the people you love, so together we can spread the belief that the most ordinary people are still capable of the most extraordinary things. And what about you? How did this story make you feel? In your own life, has a stranger ever helped you at the very moment you believed no one was left? Or have you ever been the person willing to step forward for someone else? Please share your deepest thoughts in the comments, because we truly hope to hear every story and every reflection from all of you who have accompanied this channel through every scene. Thank you for staying with us until the end of today's story. May you and your family always enjoy good health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the channel's next video.